31 hours ago. So 1911 Falls Landing Drive, apartment number or unit number 203 in Raleigh, North Carolina, 27614. So the first thing I always do whenever I try to look at a deal is I try to get a couple of data points. First one is the market rent. And I use affordablehousing.com. I go to the rental estimate. I go to the free estimate. I plug in the address and I plug in the bedroom count. This is a two bed, two bath. So let me do two bed first. And now I want to get the number for a three bed as well afterwards. Let me see what the number looks like. Let's see. Two bed is 1697. 1697. Let me write that down. 1697. This is for a that's for a three. That's for a two. Let's see what a two bed is. What is a two bed? What's a three bed? And I was trying to understand, like, hey, what's the incremental value if I add additional bedroom? 765, that's not that much, right? So you might say, hey, even if we get a three bed versus a two bed, I'm not seeing that increase in my rent in that market specifically. So let's make sure I write that down, 1765, because this affects how I look at the property and what the potential is afterwards, right? If especially if I can add an extra bedroom with the square footage. And here's what I mean. When I was looking through this property, at first glance, I was like, oh, this is pretty big. And if I had to be creative, I mean, I could have easily put in a wall right here in the dining room and then outline an additional bedroom because there's two egress points, right? There's one to the outdoors and one to the hallway. So that's one way where you can get creative, right? Usually I wouldn't try to squeeze an extra bedroom unless I'm at least over 1,200, 1,300 square feet. But for the most part, this property is relatively good shape. Looks like it's in pretty good condition. Yeah, there's some carpet, but overall, not bad. Now, the HOA on this property is 312, so that tells me it's a little pricey, but let's go ahead and analyze this, right? So I got my market rent. The second thing I want to look at is I want to look at what my payment standards are. And if you just look up Raleigh Housing Authority 20, payment standards 2026, there's only 2025 so far. And then you see this PDF, and you can see by zip code, by bedroom count, what the rent ceiling is by bedroom count, right? So the three and the two is right here, two and a three. Okay. Two is 1819, three is 2262. 1819, 1819, 2262. That was for a three bed. And this is for a two bed. Okay, so now I got some numbers, right? But because my market rent that I saw right here, right, for 1697, so I'll use 1700. I have to use the lower of the two because there is a test called the rent reasonable test when you compare the rent of a Section 8 rental versus a market rate rental. And the reason that happens or the test exists is so that you can't charge more to someone simply because they are a voucher holder. All right. So now that I got the 1700 estimate in here, again, if you guys want to analyze the deal alongside with me, you guys want to copy the spreadsheet, just go to affordablehousing.io, not .com, go to the get deal analysis tool, and that's the fastest way for you to get a copy of the spreadsheet. Okay. Now that I got that put in here, let's plug in some of the details here. This property is listed for 275 grand. 275, plug that into B4. My renovations, let's go ahead and just assume that it's pretty much turnkey. So on my rehab calculator spreadsheet, I will go here and I will say, hey, I don't really have any sort of roof repairs here because I am paying HOA. And if there is a roof expense that needs to get done, typically that is handled by the reserves in the HOA. So that's why I'm zeroing that out, which I typically don't do for a single family home, but I do it for a townhome, especially if there's an HOA. And that usually covers any exterior expenses like maintenance for the lawn and also siding, right? All that stuff matters. Now for painting, I like to just set aside a little bit of money in case I need to repaint anything, just to kind of touch up everything. So I got $1,000. For my flooring, I'm gonna assume there's about 300 square feet that I will probably have to rip up some carpet and just put in new flooring just to have some reserves there. Okay, that's $2,400, assuming 300 square feet with $8 a square foot. Just using estimates here, right? I'm just trying to figure out how far off am I from being a deal. Two bathrooms. So I always replace my toilets with high pressure assisted toilets, and this is how I have never gotten a clogged toilet call before for my unit. So this is very important for me. All right. Now, for my HVAC unit, where is the HVAC unit for this product? Do I see it outside or is it in the unit? I don't see the HVAC unit. So maybe it's inside, so I don't need a cage for it. So I can zero this out. I know that typically if the HVAC unit is outside, I like to put a cage on it so it doesn't get stolen. I've had it get stolen before, and that cost me anywhere from 5 to 10 grand. And I'm not really trying to deal with that. So whenever I see an HVAC unit outside that's not caged, I always put a cage on. That's just my personal preference because I learned from the hard way, and I hope you never had to learn the hard way like I did. So that gives me total rehab about 5 grand, $1,700 for my rent. Now let me get my taxes and my insurance from the payment calculator right here. Let's go down. You can see that the estimate right here is, where's the payment calculator? 181 for the taxes, 181. My insurance right here is 76. So I'll do equals 76 times 1.2. And I'm adding a 20% premium because usually some folks will assume that an investment property is going to be a riskier asset. That's why I'm multiplying by 1.2 so that I can add an additional buffer because insurance companies just view investment assets as a riskier asset. So I'm being conservative here. Now, for my maintenance, I'm going to put this at about 6%, right? Because I have a big HOA here for $312. Typically, I don't recommend putting zero as maintenance, right? Because something always breaks in the home, right? So setting aside 6%, that's $100 every single month. That seems pretty reasonable to me, right? Especially if you're a long-term buy and hold investor, it can never be zero because at some point somebody's going to break in a home, and if you don't set aside the right amount of money, you are underestimating your expenses, overestimating your profitability, thinking you made all this money, then bam, you have this big repair down the road, and it just wipes out all your profits. And I don't think that's very smart. So I got 10% for property management. Now you can self-manage it and save the money here, but just remember, if you don't underwrite with property management expenses, then you will never be able to outsource that job until your rents increase by more than that amount. So just be very mindful of it. I think it's a great practice to learn how to self manage it so you understand the process, so you know how to hire a property manager. But if you want to be more hands free, like you got to be able to do this. All right. Then I got 5% for my vacancy. And let's go up here. I got 25% for my down payment in F19. So my down payment amount is my B4 times my down payment percentage of 25%. So my financing amount in K6 is going to equals to my B4, which is my listing price, minus my down payment amount in E19. So I'll be financing $206,000. Now I've heard of interest rates being right now about 6.5%, which is probably the lowest it's going to be for quite a while. So I think this is probably near the bottom of the interest rates. Don't quote me on that. Listen to Housing Wire. I follow a guy named Logo Motashami, and I track the interest rates. Here's a good time for you to understand, right? The 30-year mortgage interest rates, 30-year mortgage rates versus 10-year yield. If you understand how it works, right? The mortgage rates are affected by two factors. One is the interest rate on the 10-year yield itself, and the other is going to be the spread between the 10-year yield. And now historically, that spread has been about 1.5 to 2%. Now you're seeing it's kind of narrowing back to like 2.5. Now it's like pretty much 1.8. So the spread has gotten a lot better. So you're probably not going to see any more movement from the spread. The only way you're going to see the 10-year yield dropping anymore is probably if you see a breakdown in the labor data. So you're probably at a really good time for buying. Just saying. Don't expect that much more movement, in my opinion. Okay, so now that you know how 30-year mortgage interest rates are affected, let's go ahead and figure out what the rest of the factors are. I got 2.5% for closing costs, 5 grand for renovations. So if I rent this property out as a 2-bedroom for 1,700, right? I would be negative 545 if I bought this property. Negative $145 a month. That's a negative 8.1%. So when you bought the property for 275 grand with a $5,000 rehab, just rounding here, 6.5% interest rate. Now, let's go ahead and say, well, What do I need to buy this property for in order for me to make, let's say, 8%? Right. And this is what I wanted you to kind of walk away today with is understanding how to pull the levers to figure out what is the deal for you. Right. Again, this is not investment advice. I'm not soliciting any investments on this call. I'm just simply showing you how to adjust the levers because now you can say, hey, if I see another two-bedroom property here for 110 grand, then that would be a deal. Does that mean this person will accept 110 when it's listed for 275? Probably not. Right. But now you know 110, 2% and 1700, 237, and the cash and cash return right here is 8%. So let's say your target return was 8%. That's what you have to buy it for in order to figure out what's going on. All right. Now, because we didn't see a lift going from a two-bedroom to a three-bedroom, I'm not going to go through the exercise and say, hey, what if I add $10,000 to frame an additional wall so I get extra rent? Right? That's not the case here. But let's say you're in a market where they're paying top dollar for the rent, 2262, right? So unless you get some indication from a property manager or another real estate investor saying like, hey, you can actually get 2262 as a three-bedroom here, right? Because they don't have as much two bedrooms. Well, if you do that and you add 10 grand for framing an additional bedroom here with the walls and everything, what can you buy it for if you get 2262? Now, I'm just doing the theory with you so that you can understand the exercises and the steps to figure out what's the deal, right? So now if your return is still targeting 8%, now all of a sudden you might be willing to say, hey, I can pay 168,000 for this deal, right? If I get 2262 as a three bedroom, 2262. Now my cash and cash return, my cash flow per month is 406 after all my expenses. That gets me to about a roughly 8% return, or 7.9 to be exact. And I'll have to buy this property for $168,000. And that's how you figure out what the levers are that you're pulling. Because now you're assuming a $15,000 rehab rate, 25% down, 6.5% interest rate, right? If the interest rate go up and down, again, you do the same levers. But this is what I want to kind of show you because you need to figure out what is the deal for you, right? It's not a investment. You have to decide what the return makes sense for you. Because you might say, hey, you know what? I want to manage this because I'm just a small mom and pop landlord. I am going to self manage it myself. So I am not going to have any property management expenses. I don't recommend that, right? Because you're lying to yourself. But hey, sometimes people don't count what they pay themselves as expenses. So if you don't do that, right, then now all of a sudden, what are you willing to pay? Because you just took out 8%, I mean, 10% of the expenses. Now all of a sudden, this is why you understand why people are willing to pay 205 for this deal. Because you say, hey, no property management expenses. I'm able to rent it out for 2262. I am now cashing on 457 a month, right? I'm self-managing here. And this is why you see people or investors doing offers at different levels because they don't consider their self-management expenses as expenses. So you got to be very careful and be realistic about, hey, what are my exit options? If I want to sell this to another investor, will they see this as a deal? And if that's an investor that isn't self managing, then they won't see this as a deal. And that limits your exit options tremendously. You just got to go into this eyes wide open because you might say, hey, this is a 7.7% return for me. But that's because I have no property management expenses in there. For somebody else analyzing it, there's no way that they're going to pay 205 if their target return was 8%, as an example. And that's the scenario I want you to understand and the exercise I want you to go through with yourself so that you can be really honest with yourself about what your true return is and also what your exit options are should you not count your own property managing expenses because you are self-managing. But if you want there to be more exit options for you down the road, then you have to underwrite it with that in mind because that investor or the next investor down the line that might be buying a property from you when you want to exit this property, they're going to underwrite with property management expenses. And that to them is not going to be a deal because they're like, hey, that was the deal 168, not 205. But you bought it at 205 because you did not include your own self-management expenses or property management expenses. And that's the crucial item I want you to walk away from today is understanding what all the levers are that you can pull and more importantly, how to get the right data so that you can adjust those levers accordingly. All right. I hope you all have an amazing Saturday. I'll see you all tomorrow for day 842. Let's stay consistent. Let's keep analyzing a deal every single day. I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a good one, everybody.